Mary is a landscape artist who believes in roots, history, and organic beauty. Her world is built on patience, earth, and a fierce passion for preservation. Cillian is the ambitious architect set on demolishing the past to build the future. His world is made of steel, absolute control, and invisible power. The only thing that links them is a single battlefield, a historic plot of land in the heart of the city. What begins as a tense confrontation quickly escalates into a forced collaboration, where the chemistry is immediate and the distrust is deep. Mary sees the vulnerable soul beneath Cillian's flawless facade. He, in turn, sees her authenticity as the only real thing in his empire of lies. As their meetings become the only truth they dare to admit, Mary begins to feel the weight of his secretive influence. When the danger reaches her world, Cillian is forced to reveal the absolute, terrifying truth. The architect is, in reality, a powerful boss, and his protection is more dangerous than any threat. Will their love be strong enough to sustain a man who governs the shadows, or will the force of his secret world destroy the only authentic thing he dared to love? This is a slow-burn romance about the fight to build a legacy together, no matter the price of the foundation. To find out how this story of passion and power ends, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and comment below. What is the type of story you love the most? The sound was not a symphony. Mary usually worked to the whisper of leaves, the gentle swoosh of water over moss, or the satisfying crunch of boots on gravel. Here, the air was a brutal, vibrating thing, thick with the grinding noise of machinery, a relentless metallic beat of destruction. The soles of her thick tread boots hummed with every blow of the wrecking ball against the historic limestone wall, a pulse of concrete violence that made her jaw ache. A raw heat climbed her neck, yet her spine felt like a cold piece of iron, an anchor against the rising tide of defeat. She stood on what used to be the wrought iron fence line of old St. Augustine's College. The scent was an aggressive, dry mix of pulverized stone, hot diesel, and a bitter undercurrent of ozone. Her blue eyes, usually soft with the contemplation of growth, hardened to the color of the granite she wanted to save. The stately neoclassical facade, the heart of her planned community garden, was being swallowed by colossal steel jaws. She clutched her binder, a paper shield against the steel leviathan. He waited for her in the shadow of a massive, idling excavation truck. Cillian. He was the developer, the master planner, the architect of what was to be. He wore tailored chinos and a charcoal button-down, pristine save for a fine patina of sight dust. His shoes, expensive Italian leather, looked offensively clean against the debris. He didn't move. He simply watched her approach, his stillness a deliberate show of control. The first sensation to strike her was the quality of his presence. He was powerful, undeniable, like a foundation of deep-poured concrete. But beyond that, it was the silence around him. He existed in the eye of the storm, his own pocket of still, heavy air. "Mary?" His voice was deep, a low baritone that seemed to resonate directly in her chest cavity. It was a statement of fact, no warmth, no question. She stopped several paces away, the distance a conscious effort to resist his gravity. "Cillian," the name came out sharp, laced with warning. "You led me to believe we had a final meeting. You didn't mention you would start demolishing before the contract was even dry." Cillian's lips curved, a sliver of a smile that was all shape and no warmth. A calculated gesture. "I informed you time was of the essence. You presented a dream. I follow a timeline. Construction doesn't wait for sentiment, Mary. This land is mine. What I build on it is my legacy." He took a slow step toward her, and the atmosphere shifted. Mary felt the unmistakable warmth that radiated from him, a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. His eyes were a penetrating blue, an intense shade that seemed to hold the cold depth of the deep ocean, but his lids were slightly narrowed, assessing every shift in her body language. It was insane. It was wrong. Yet, it was undeniably real. Her heart began to beat against her ribs with frantic speed, but the cause was not the collapsing wall. It was his proximity, the sharp scent of him, a potent mix of expensive leather, clean musk, and a faint metallic edge, like a newly cut steel beam. He hated the distraction. He told himself it was the stress of the timeline, but deep down, he knew it was the lie. His composure, his control. It was all threatened by her stubbornness. He wanted to maintain dominance. Yet, this woman, with the dirt smudged across her cheek, made him want to commit the ultimate act of weakness, to touch her face. He averted his gaze, a subtle, necessary break in the tension. Cillian raised a hand to his jaw, clenching the muscle beneath his skin for a brief moment, forcing his impulse back down. He needed to dictate the terms. "Listen," he continued, his voice dropping just low enough to force her to lean in, to break her self-imposed boundary against the noise. "I have an offer, one that will silence your preservationists and give you a chance to plant your roots, in a much more productive, visible site." Mary felt a hot blush creep up her neck, a telltale sign of the composure she was fighting to project. "Plant my roots? You think this is a game?" "I know you are excellent," Cillian cut her off, his eyes locking back onto hers, fixed and consuming. "I saw your work at Park 6. The reclamation you performed there. It was a resurrection. I have a new project, overlooking the river. High-end, expensive, and sterile. It needs soul. I want your soul in it. I want your authenticity." He extended his hand. Not for a shake, but an imperious invitation. Mary looked at his hand. It was large, the fingers long and powerful, the skin tanned and marked by labor, but carefully groomed. It was the hand of a man who built things, but who also claimed them. The silence that fell between them, despite the roar of the equipment, was deafening. It was worse than any shouting. It was the silence of inevitability, the moment when the resistance crumbles. She straightened the cuff of her jacket, a meaningless adjustment that betrayed her rising nervousness. Accept? Accepting meant working closely with him, exposing herself to that unyielding heat, that constant tension. Rejecting him meant losing the only power she had to protect the city she loved. "It's madness," she whispered, the words barely audible. "It's who I am, Mary," he replied, the shadow of a satisfied predator touching his blue eyes. And this time, the look was not cold. It was a challenge. She closed her eyes for a single second, tasting the metallic bitterness of surrender. Then, Mary extended her hand, the movement of a person signing a pact, and took his. The touch was firm, dry, and electric. The warmth of his skin was a sharp contrast to the slight dampness of hers. His day-old shadow, which she could smell on the air, barely grazed her smooth skin as their hands met. A connection that transcended desire, rooted in unbreakable power. "The price of your authenticity," he said, tightening his grip, his eyes demanding her attention, "is your temporary loyalty." Mary pulled her hand back, her palm still stinging. She could feel the taste of the fight lingering on her tongue. "I am loyal to my art," she stated, her voice steady. "Not to your ledger." Cillian merely inclined his head, the satisfied predator. "That is a start." He turned, walking toward a black, polished SUV, leaving Mary alone with the smell of concrete and the persistent ache of surrender in her hand. He had just purchased the only thing he could not buy, and Mary felt her heart beating to the heavy rhythm of the jackhammer, a fierce premonition that she knew would change everything. The stinging sensation had faded from Mary's palm, but the memory of Cillian's grip remained, a residual heat beneath the cool exterior of her professional demeanor. She sat 2 days later in a conference room that smelled faintly of polished wood and an aggressive, expensive disinfectant. The scent was a perfect metaphor for Cillian's world, sterile, controlled, and meant to eliminate anything deemed chaotic or natural. She hated the room. She hated the sterile white model of the riverfront tower on the table, a skyscraper of glass and cold steel, a monument to vertical ambition. But she loved the opportunity. "I am here for the garden," she repeated to herself, a mantra against the rising tension in her chest. Cillian arrived 10 minutes late. Not rushed, but deliberate. The tardiness felt like a statement of dominance, a tiny skirmish in their ongoing, unstated war. He wore a dark navy suit that looked poured onto his body, a flawless armor. When he entered, the 2 other people in the room, a sharp, nervous lawyer named Tristan, and an executive assistant named Zara, visibly stiffened. It wasn't the sound of his footsteps, which were muffled by the thick carpet, but the sheer shift in atmospheric pressure. He dismissed the two with a small flicking gesture of his hand, a wordless command. They were alone. Cillian walked to the head of the table, not sitting, but resting a hip against the polished wood. He picked up a small, perfectly modeled shrub from the landscape design and turned it over in his large hand, his focus completely on the plastic plant. "This is an absurdity," he said, the sound flat and low. "A billion-dollar project, and I have to present a mock-up that includes miniature boxwood hedges." "It's called placemaking, Cillian," Mary replied, her voice steady. She took a slow sip of the chilled water, tasting the metallic tang of the glass rim. "It's what draws people in. Roots, grounding, not just glass reflecting other glass." He was trying to get under her skin. He was trying to provoke her. Mary repeated to herself that she would not declare war on a plastic tree. Cillian set the model shrub down gently. Too gently. His eyes, that intense, penetrating blue, finally lifted to meet hers. "We're not building a home for hippies, Mary. We're building a landmark. But I conceded to the green space. Now I need you to commit. Show me how your roots can make a sterile tower feel like a legacy." Legacy. That word was the only bait that could ever hook her. She felt her muscles relax by a fraction, a tactical error he immediately sensed. "The soil is poor," she said, leaning forward. She unfolded her own modest plans, sketches drawn in pencil, annotated with notes on local flora and drainage. The contrast between her messy, living documents and his pristine, digital ones was stark. "The riverfront is beautiful, but the ground is weak. If we are truly building a legacy, we need to focus on structure beneath the surface. Deep-rooted, resilient native species, not just superficial planting." She looked up. Cillian's gaze was no longer sharp with challenge. It was dark with unexpected focus. He was listening. Truly listening. "Structure beneath the surface," he murmured, his thumb rubbing the corner of the table. "You believe the foundation is more important than the facade." "Always," she confirmed, feeling a wave of conviction rush through her. This was the only place they truly connected. The belief in the absolute necessity of a solid foundation. Cillian stood up, walking slowly around the table toward her side. Mary felt her breath hitch, not in fear, but in sharp, instantaneous awareness. He stopped behind her chair, placing both hands flat on the table, flanking her. She was trapped between the cold edge of the wood and his immediate, overwhelming warmth. It was inappropriate. It was a power play. It was intoxicating. "Show me," he commanded, his voice now lower, a rumble in the space directly behind her ear. "Show me which deep-rooted species you recommend. Show me where you hide the strength." Mary's hands were shaking slightly as she tried to point to the diagram. She could smell him now. Not just the fleeting scent of steel and leather, but a specific, close scent. A faint musk of his own body heat, sharp and clean. A delicious distraction. The cypress is indigenous," she stammered, pointing a trembling finger. "It anchors the soil, filters the water. It doesn't look ostentatious, but it has the deepest roots of anything we have." Cillian leaned closer, his chest brushing the back of her chair. Mary could feel the solid heat of him through the thin fabric of her blouse. He didn't look at the diagram. He looked at the subtle tremors in her hand. "A species that anchors the soil," he repeated, his breath a faint whisper against her hair. "One that doesn't advertise its strength." He lifted one hand from the table. Mary held her breath, waiting for the touch she knew would shatter her resolve. He didn't touch her. Instead, he simply tapped the diagram, directly over her selection of the cypress tree. "Make it so, Mary," he said, his voice regaining its professional steel. "Let's see if your roots can hold up my tower." He walked away from her, the warmth receding, leaving a cold vacuum in his wake. Mary didn't turn around until the heavy oak door clicked shut, the sound echoing in the silent room. She sat for a long time, staring at the drawing of the cypress tree. The tremor in her hand had migrated to the pit of her stomach, a nervous, expectant knot. She convinced herself it was the pressure of the project, but as she inhaled slowly, taking in the lingering scent of his presence, she knew it was a lie. It was the fear, and the perverse excitement, of discovering just how deep Cillian's own roots went, and how close she was to finding the man hidden beneath the concrete facade. Mary and Cillian's professional collision had settled into an uncomfortable rhythm. They met twice a week, always in the sterile conference room, the vast glass model of the riverfront tower, a silent third party. The intimacy was subtle, carried only in the duration of their eye contact and the proximity necessitated by reading blueprints. But outside that room, Mary began to feel an unshakable sense of observation. Her small, independent projects, the community garden on the city's south side, the preservation fund, had always been a logistical nightmare. Permits were always stalled, deliveries delayed, and bureaucratic walls seemed to rise simply to spite her efforts. Suddenly, those walls began to crumble. One morning, a crucial shipment of specialized soil, held up in the city port for 3 weeks, simply appeared at her construction site, fully processed, signed, and cleared. There were no explanations. There was no invoice. That afternoon, a municipal inspector who had been particularly aggressive about a minor zoning issue called to apologize for the misunderstanding, clearing the way for her foundation work to begin immediately. Mary sat in her small, dust-filled office, staring at the official paperwork. Her heart hammered a frantic tattoo against her ribs. But it wasn't joy. It was a cold dread. This wasn't the slow, painstaking process of civic negotiation. This was the work of an unseen, powerful hand, a hand that bypassed systems. She thought immediately of Cillian. She picked up the phone, her fingers tight around the plastic. She had to hear his voice to confirm the source of the dread. "Cillian," she stated, without preamble, when he answered. The sound quality was perfect, too clear for a cell phone, suggesting a private line. "Mary, did your precious topsoil arrive?" His voice was low, carrying a faint, knowing humor. It did, along with an unnecessary apology from Inspector Silas. "Coincidences don't favor me, Cillian. This is the work of influence." There was a calculated pause on the line. The silence was heavier than any spoken denial. It was the absolute, unquestionable silence of a man who held all the cards. "I am an architect, Mary," he finally said. "I specialize in structure and flow. Logistics is a specialty. When I see inefficiency, I correct it. You correct it, or you force it. Does it matter? Your project is moving forward. You have your soil. The roots can take hold." The simple, professional phrasing was designed to deflect, but it confirmed everything. He was using his empire to serve her small, organic world. The sudden image of his hand, large and strong, reaching across a vast chasm to plant her tiny seeds, made her throat constrict. "You don't do favors, Cillian," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "There's always a cost. What is it?" "The cost," he said, and the tone shifted, becoming softer, more dangerous. "Is simple. Transparency. I want to see the honesty of your process. I want to know why this legacy is worth more to you than money." He wasn't talking about the garden. He was talking about the deepest part of her. "Meet me tonight," he continued, the invitation not a request, but a subtle, magnetic pull. "Not in the White Room, somewhere real. I need to see the ground you're fighting for." Mary put the phone down, her skin tingling, not from excitement, but from the terrifying intimacy of his unspoken demand. She knew it was a test, a calculated move to force her out of her controlled environment. That evening, she met him not at a chic restaurant, but at the abandoned site of her community garden. The area was lit only by a single, harsh security light that cast long, dramatic shadows. Cillian was waiting by a rusted chain-link fence. He was in casual wear, a black sweater and dark pants, and the lack of his suit only amplified his latent power. He looked less like an architect, and more like a man accustomed to taking decisive action in the dark. She approached him slowly, her heart beating out a tight, nervous rhythm. "This is it," she said, gesturing to the uneven ground. Hard soil, no glamour, the essence of the fight. Cillian didn't look at the ground. He looked only at her. His blue eyes were dark in the low light, but they held her gaze with an intensity that burned away the shadows. "Why the risk, Mary? You could take my riverfront money and secure this project 100 times over without fighting the city." "Because this is an ecosystem, Cillian. It has roots. It has neighbors. It has a soul. Your tower is a beautiful, empty shell waiting for one." He took one step closer. The gap between them closed, and the air immediately thickened. He was so close she could feel the subtle shift in the oxygen. He lifted his hand, a slow, deliberate, powerful gesture. Mary's breath hitched. She fought the impulse to pull back, standing her ground against the looming threat of physical closeness. He didn't touch her. Instead, he reached past her, his hand moving to the chain-link fence just behind her head. He placed his large palm flat against the cold metal, trapping her gently against the boundary. "You are so passionate about what grows naturally," he murmured, his voice now barely audible. A resonant vibration meant only for her. "I wonder what kind of structure your passion could anchor." The subtle, non-sexual proximity was overwhelming. The power of the gesture, pinning her with only a palm on a fence, was more intimate than any touch could have been. Mary felt the familiar, hot rush of blood to her cheeks. She couldn't look away from his eyes. She saw the question there, a deep, silent inquiry into the foundation of her being. She knew, in that terrifying electric moment, that he wasn't just fixing her logistics problems. He was building a pathway into her life, clearing the bureaucratic noise so that he could finally be heard. The cost of his influence was simply her attention, and he had it, completely. He dropped his hand from the fence. The metallic ring of the chain link vibrating was the only sound in the quiet lot. Cillian gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of quiet acceptance of her surrender. "Good night, Mary," he said, turning into the shadows. "I'll see you in the sterile room." Mary stood frozen, the ghost of his presence still pressing against her back, wondering which room was truly the most dangerous. She had just realized that Cillian's influence wasn't an act of charity. It was the profound, silent beginning of his protection. The forced collaboration had morphed into something dangerously close to complicity. Cillian and Mary's meetings were no longer confined to the conference room. They took place on the construction site of the riverfront tower itself. She needed to evaluate the soil. He needed to ensure she saw his vision. The professional necessity was a flimsy excuse they both silently maintained. Mary found herself spending hours next to him, the rhythm of their work, her careful measurements, his cold architectural directions, a strange kind of synchronized dance. Today, the air was thick with the dust of freshly cut stone and the metallic scent of rebar. Cillian was reviewing a core sample of the foundation, his concentration absolute. He had removed his jacket, his dark shirt straining slightly across the breadth of his shoulders as he leaned over the rough material. Mary approached to show him a new drainage plan for the rooftop garden. The ground was uneven, covered with gravel and debris. She stumbled slightly, her foot catching on a piece of wire. The physical contact was instantaneous and accidental. Cillian's large hand shot out, not to grab her, but to steady her elbow. The warmth of his touch, a sudden searing pressure against the sensitive skin of her forearm, went straight to her core. It was a fraction of a second, but in that moment, the entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. He released her as quickly as he caught her. "Careful, Mary." His voice was level, almost harsh. A command disguised as concern. Mary didn't look at him. She looked at the muddy, trembling hand that had been held by his. The shock was purely internal. Her breath hitched, trapped in her throat. It wasn't the sensation of being touched. It was the sheer force of his immediate protective reflex. It revealed a deep-seated instinct that had nothing to do with building codes or landscaping. "Thank you," she managed, her voice a thin, reedy sound. She fought the blush that threatened to rise and betray her. Cillian didn't acknowledge her thanks. He simply averted his gaze, focusing intensely on the inert core sample. But Mary saw it. The almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, the muscle clenching and releasing. A silent battle being fought within him. He was furious at himself for the slip, for the admission of human concern. Mary forced herself to look at the plans. "The new drainage requires us to shift the position of the main utility line by a meter. We need to avoid flooding the planters during heavy rain." Shifting utilities is not ideal, Cillian replied, his voice regaining its steel. It's costly, but necessary. I will handle the logistics. As Cillian turned to make the call, Mary was left alone, surrounded by the physical evidence of his empire. She inhaled, drawing in the complex scent of the construction site. Dust, exhaust, and a faint underlying hint of his cologne. A scent she was beginning to associate with safety, even as it signaled danger. Cillian's inner chamber, POV shift. Cillian stood 10 feet away, staring out at the river, his hand pressed against the cold metal railing. He wasn't looking at the barges or the current. He was seeing the image of her face, the fleeting moment of genuine panic, and the sudden overwhelming instinct to stabilize her. It was a mistake. It was a liability. He hated the tremor that ran through his own hand after he released her. That small, unplanned contact, the brief brush of skin, had been more disruptive than a police raid. It was a crack in his control, an admission that Mary was no longer just a colleague but a weakness. A low cough from behind him broke the internal monologue. The soil arrived quickly, didn't it, Cillian? Cillian did not turn around. He knew the voice. Cormac, his consigliere, his voice of cold reason, stood there, a quiet, impeccably dressed shadow. Cormac was the man who handled the logistics that no architect's office ever saw. The city is moving quickly on permits, Cillian responded, his voice neutral. The city moves quickly when its palms are greased, or when its knees are threatened, Cormac countered, his tone devoid of judgment, only fact. But that is a distraction. The landscape woman, Mary, she's become a variable. Cillian finally turned, his gaze sharp and cold. She is essential to the facade. Her involvement legitimizes the project. She legitimizes you, Cormac corrected gently. She is the only human thing you've allowed near the operation. The family is concerned. A person of principle is a dangerous anchor. She will eventually pull too hard. Cillian took a deep, slow breath, inhaling the dry, chemical scent of the river air. He looked past Cormac, seeing Mary, now checking the level of a retaining wall, entirely absorbed in her work, entirely unaware of the conversation that sealed her danger. She was the truth he wanted to build, the only authentic thing he had allowed into his artificial world. She is protected, Cillian said, his voice dropping to a low, irreversible command. She is mine to manage. Her safety is non-negotiable. She is vital to the stability of the foundation. Do you understand, Cormac? Cormac's face remained impassive. I understand the instruction, Cillian. But the threat is not external. The greatest threat to the boss is always the one that makes him forget the rules. Cormac turned and left as quietly as he had arrived, his words a cold poison seeping into the concrete. Cillian watched his consigliere disappear. He looked back at Mary, her face earnest and focused beneath the morning sun. The memory of the quick heat of her skin against his palm flared again. He hated the tremor in his hands. He forced himself to walk away, the distance between them a necessary lifeline. He could not touch her again. That one accidental brush had revealed too much of the impossibility of their connection. He walked to the darkest part of the site, leaving Mary to her roots and her relentless authenticity, fighting the desire to return and simply stand next to her, feeling the warmth of the only human truth he had ever cared to build. The invitation was not a question. It was a card, heavy, creamy, and embossed with cold, minimalist silver. The annual fundraising gala for the city's Modern Architectural Preservation Society, a clear facade event for Cillian's organization to mingle with legitimate power. Mary stared at the card on her desk. The only human thing you've allowed near the operation. Cormac's words, spoken to Cillian, echoed in her mind. Mary knew her presence was a calculated move. Cillian was using her authenticity as a shield and a badge of legitimacy. She hated the game, but she wanted to see the full architecture of his other world. She accepted. The event was held in a penthouse ballroom, a vast, echoing space of glass and marble that seemed suspended over the city lights. It smelled of white lilies, rare perfume, and the faint, cold scent of new money. Mary, uncomfortable in a borrowed emerald dress, felt like an invasive species in a curated garden. She saw Cillian immediately. He was devastatingly formal in a black tuxedo. He stood with the kind of absolute stillness that demanded attention, yet he was surrounded by movement, sycophants, politicians, and sharp, angular women. One woman in particular stood closest to him, Ilara. Her dress was a study in severe lines, a sharp metallic blue that matched her precise, controlled movements. She was a corporate lawyer Cillian often worked with, a woman who spoke the cold language of logic and acquisition. Every time Ilara spoke, Cillian would incline his head, the gesture intimate in its professional trust. Mary felt a sudden, fierce clenching in her stomach, a physical reaction she immediately dismissed as indigestion from the canapes. It was not jealousy. It was the simple, logical understanding that Ilara was his counterpart, equally cold, equally powerful, and completely safe. Cillian, catching her gaze from across the room, gave her a minimal, almost imperceptible nod. A silent, magnetic tether. Mary navigated the room, drawn by the same compulsion that drew her to touch a hot surface. When she finally reached his immediate orbit, he introduced her. Ilara, this is Mary Riley. She is anchoring the ground-level landscape design for the riverfront tower. Mary, Ilara Vance. She ensures the foundation stays anchored. Ilara's smile was precise, a flash of white against sharp cheekbones. A difficult task. One must be ruthless about what gets to stay and what is removed. She paused, her eyes coolly assessing Mary from the tips of her heels to the borrowed neckline of her dress. A landscaper. An interesting choice, Cillian. Rather organic. The word organic was clearly an insult. Mary felt a wave of anger, a hot rush of blood that energized her. Only the resilient survive, Ilara, Mary countered, her voice low and steady. The biggest difference between architecture and life is that you can't build a soul. You can only nourish the one that already exists. Cillian's face remained neutral, but Mary saw the change. The subtle, almost instantaneous relaxing of the muscle in his jaw. A tiny flicker of satisfaction in his blue eyes. Ilara merely sipped her champagne, her gaze unwavering. A poetic thought. Ideal in contracts. They are much less fragile than souls. Mary was suddenly aware of the thinness of her own emotional shield. She was out of her element, exposed. Cillian ended the exchange. He placed his large hand lightly on the small of Mary's back, a minimal, non-sexual touch meant only to guide. If you will excuse us, Ilara, Mary and I have an early structural review. He maneuvered her away, guiding her through the crowd with the absolute, unhurried control of a man who owned the space. Mary could feel the pressure of his palm. Minimal, yet inescapable. It was a possessive gesture, a public claiming meant for the eyes of Ilara and everyone else. But as they moved, the intensity of his hand on her back shifted. It was no longer a formality. It became a subtle, powerful protection, a barrier against the cold stares and the whispered judgments of his elite circle. They reached a secluded corner by the glass overlooking the glittering, conquered city. "Why bring me here?" Mary whispered, turning to face him. Her voice was taut. "To prove you can tame the wildlife?" Cillian's eyes were deep and unwavering. "I brought you here so you would know the full measure of the ground you stand on, and so that they would know you are my concern." He was inches from her. The proximity was overwhelming. She could smell the crisp, expensive scent of his tuxedo and the fainter, underlying musk that was uniquely his. He lifted his hand from her back. Mary's heart pounded, her entire nervous system expecting the touch that was now inevitable between them. Instead, Cillian slowly raised his hand to his own face, rubbing the back of his neck with a frustrated intensity. His gaze drifted away from hers, a sudden, deliberate withdrawal. The conflict was written on his face, the absolute need for control fighting against the clear, burning honesty of his concern. He wanted to shield her. He hated that he felt the need. "The people in this room," Cillian said, his voice quiet, "they respect strength. They respect ownership. But they respect a clear boundary more. Do not stray from the boundary I have set for you." He was telling her he had drawn a circle of protection around her, and the cost was that she had to stay inside it. Mary felt the truth of his statement settle in her stomach. A cold, hard weight. He hadn't brought her here to shame her. He had brought her to show her the full extent of the danger he was shielding her from, and the cost of his love. "And what if I don't want your protection, Cillian?" she asked, the words a challenge she knew she couldn't win. He finally turned back, his blue eyes intense and absolute. "It's too late for that, Mary. You have already become a structural necessity." He held her gaze for a long, devastating moment. The intensity of his look, the ultimate, profound intimacy. He didn't need to touch her. The connection was sealed, and the choice was made. Not by her, but by the gravitational pull of his immense, dangerous world. The morning after the gala, Mary was back at the community garden site. The previous night's silk and champagne felt like a distant, absurd dream. She was focused on the soil, grounding herself with the familiar scent of earth and mulch. Her lead volunteer, a kind, elderly woman named Esther, approached her, her face drawn with worry. "Mary, the fence, and the equipment." Mary followed Esther's gaze. The chain-link fence on the north side, the one Cillian had leaned against days ago, was down. Not dismantled, but cut, clean, precise slices in the metal mesh. Worse, the small rented backhoe, crucial for grading the land, was completely incapacitated, its engine block covered in a thick, sticky foam. This was not a mistake. This was deliberate. Mary felt a knot of cold dread twist in her gut. She immediately thought of the high-stakes game Cillian played. Her project was being used as a weapon against him. A warning. She called him immediately. His voice, when he answered, was tight, devoid of the low amusement she had come to expect. "Cillian, my site. Vandalism. The backhoe is totaled. The fence is cut. It's a professional job." There was a half-second pause on the line. It was the longest, coldest silence she had ever heard from him. The silence of a man who instantly understood the full scope of the threat. "Go home, Mary. Now," he commanded, his voice dropping to a low, irreversible gravel. It was the voice of the boss, stripped of any pretense of architecture. "Do not speak to the police. Do not touch anything. Wait for my call." He hung up. The abrupt cutoff was a shock of cold air. Mary was too stubborn to simply flee. She stood rooted to the spot, her heart hammering with a mixture of terror and fierce defiance. She had to document the damage. 10 minutes later, the first sign of Cillian's influence arrived. Not a uniformed police car, but a matte black SUV that pulled silently to the curb, followed by 2 identical vehicles. A team of 4 men emerged. They were large, quiet, and utterly unremarkable in their dark, tailored suits. They moved with a chilling efficiency. They were not builders. They were not police. They were security. Mary watched, hidden behind a stack of bagged compost, as the leader of the team, a broad man with the impenetrable stillness of a well-trained guard, walked straight to the cut fence. He took pictures, spoke into a tiny microphone concealed on his cuff, and then turned his attention to the foam-covered backhoe. The man didn't flinch. He didn't curse. He simply assessed. Then, the lead man took a second, smaller team to the edges of the site, searching the periphery, marking the ground. Mary saw a sudden movement from the lead guard. He stopped by an overgrown hedge and reached into the foliage, pulling out a small metallic object, a surveillance device. This was the shadow of his power. This was the logistics that Cormac had talked about. This was the efficiency that bypassed every law and every bureaucratic process. It was terrifying in its absolute cold effectiveness. A final black SUV arrived, pulling directly onto the gravel. Cillian stepped out. He hadn't changed clothes since the gala. His tuxedo pants were slightly dusted with construction debris, but his white shirt was immaculate. He moved with a brutal, focused energy Mary had never seen. He walked past his men without a word, his eyes fixed only on the damaged backhoe. He knelt down, ignoring the foam, his hands touching the engine block. The lead guard approached him and spoke in a low, rapid, coded language that Mary couldn't understand. Cillian listened, his face a mask of absolute control. Then, the control cracked. Cillian stood up abruptly, his hands balling into tight fists at his sides. Mary saw it, the flash of pure, unadulterated rage that flickered across his face. It was gone in a moment, replaced by a terrifying, absolute coldness. He didn't shout. He didn't gesture. He simply spoke 2 words to his lead guard, 2 quiet syllables that were more chilling than any scream. "Find him." The guard simply nodded, turning to his team. No questions, only immediate, silent obedience. Mary felt the full, crushing weight of his reality. This wasn't the architect who debated soil type. This was the man who controlled the unseen infrastructure of the city, the one who moved with the swift, deadly intent of a predator defending his territory. She was the territory. She stepped out from behind the compost, unable to stay hidden any longer. "Cillian," her voice cracked slightly. He turned, and the intensity of his gaze, that dark, cold blue, hit her like a physical blow. The look held a raw mix of fury and a profound, bone-deep relief that she was unharmed. He dismissed his men with a curt wave. He walked toward her, slowly, deliberately, forcing her to hold her ground. When he reached her, he didn't touch her. He simply stood over her, his immense presence a suffocating weight. "You were told to leave," he grated out, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You defied a direct instruction." "I needed to see the damage," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the angry tightness of his jaw. "I needed to see you." "What you are seeing, Mary," he said, his voice dropping in volume, intensifying the focus, "is the cost of the ground you stand on. The foundation is not just concrete, it is force. And I will use any amount of force to ensure that you, and what you build, remain untouched." He didn't touch her, but the sheer power of his proximity was overwhelming. She felt the cold reality of the threat, and the heat of his ferocious, unspoken protection. The fear and the attraction, the shock and the intense connection, were now inseparable. Mary stood there, trembling not from cold, but from the sudden, profound knowledge that she had just witnessed the boss's soul, and he had just proven that for her, he was willing to break all his own rules. The atmosphere between them was now charged with a terrifying, absolute truth. The professional facade was shattered. Mary knew, beyond doubt, that she was in a relationship with a man capable of command and retribution that skirted the edges of the law. 2 days passed. Cillian did not call, but the silence was louder than any call could have been. The guards he had dispatched remained at her community garden site, unobtrusive, yet omnipresent. They worked in shifts, quiet, dark shadows that stood sentinel over her small patch of earth. Mary felt suffocated by the care. She needed to breathe the truth. She drove unannounced to the riverfront site. She found Cillian in his usual secluded corner, overlooking the city he controlled. He was staring at the model, but his eyes were vacant. He didn't need to turn to know she was there. "I told you to wait for my call," he said, his voice flat, exhausted. "I can't breathe your silence, Cillian," she retorted, walking toward him, her footsteps sharp against the polished floor. "I saw what happened. I saw your men. I saw your face. I need to know the full cost of your protection." She stopped directly in front of him, forcing the eye contact. His blue eyes were clouded, heavy with the burden she knew he carried. "You saw efficiency," he insisted, his voice hardening, trying to rebuild the wall. "Logistics. A quick response to a threat to a major investment." "Don't lie to me," Mary whispered, her voice cracking with the emotional strain. "That was not an architect's efficiency. That was a boss's fury. Who are you, Cillian? And what are you protecting me from?" Cillian's jaw tightened again, the muscle flexing violently. He took a slow, deep breath, tasting the dust of the construction site. He wanted to confess. He wanted to shed the weight, to finally build an authentic connection with her. But the confession would place her in a danger he could not shield her from. It was the impossibility of honesty. It was the weakness of his strength. He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the desk model between them, his large, powerful hands dwarfing the tiny, perfect glass skyscraper. His gaze pinned hers. The tension was an almost physical thing, a thick, invisible wire drawn taut between them. "I am the man who has spent his entire life building an empire from dirt and blood," he ground out, the admission raw and chilling. "I am the man who controls everything beneath this city, the contracts, the flow, the construction, the people. Because I saw what happens to people who have no control." He was confessing to the magnitude of his power, without ever using the word mafia. He gave her the truth of his role, but not the name of his organization. Mary's own heart was hammering so loudly she could hear the blood rush in her ears. She felt the tears welling up, not of fear, but of profound understanding. "And that man," she challenged, her voice low and steady, "is terrified of losing the tiny, fragile thing he chose to build a home for. Am I right?" Cillian's eyes snapped shut for a brief, agonizing moment. It was a gesture of utter surrender. He opened them again, and the look he gave her was raw, unguarded, and broken. It was the face of the man beneath the steel. "I am terrified," he admitted, his voice barely a breath. "I am terrified of your honesty. I am terrified of what you see. And I am terrified that if I tell you the rest of the truth, you will disappear, and I will lose the only thing in this sterile world that has ever felt real." He slowly reached across the glass model. Mary watched his large hand move toward hers, which was resting on a blueprint. The moment stretched into an eternity. This touch would not be accidental. It would be a choice, a profound emotional commitment. Just before his fingers brushed hers, Cillian stopped. He pulled his hand back, clenching it into a fist that rested on the table. He couldn't risk the physical contact. The risk was too high. Instead, he looked directly into her eyes, transferring the entire weight of his truth into his gaze. "You have no idea of the power I wield, Mary. But know this. I would use every ounce of it. I would risk the entire empire to ensure that you remain untouched." He paused, his breath ragged. "I would do anything to keep you safe, Mary. That is your cost. And that is my curse." The intensity of his look was an emotional kiss, a profound surrender of his soul. Mary did not move. She felt the rush of tears, but she held them back. She had just seen the man buried beneath the boss. He was confessing to his protection, to his fear, to the fact that her small, organic life was the one thing he could not control, and therefore, the only thing he truly valued. She finally broke the contact, pulling back, not in rejection, but in the overwhelming need for air. "I'll see you tomorrow, Cillian," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed emotion. She turned and left. Cillian remained, head bowed over the table, his hand still clenched into a fist. He had kept his secret, but he had lost his heart. And the truth he had just confessed was a foundation far more dangerous than any his architects had designed. The fragile truce established after their confrontation was based on a single silent premise: acceptance. Mary had accepted the shadow of Cillian's power, and Cillian had accepted the weakness of his own heart. One late afternoon, Cillian arrived at Mary's small office. He was dressed in worn jeans and a thick, dark work jacket, the clothes of a man engaged in manual labor, not of a high-power executive. He looked less like the boss, and more like a man trying to remember who he was. "No meetings today," he stated, his voice low. "No blueprints. I need your opinion on a separate project." "A project that requires your work clothes?" Mary asked, raising a delicate eyebrow. "A project that requires honesty," he countered. He extended a hand toward her, the gesture open but not demanding. "Come with me. I need to show you where I learned about foundations." Mary took her jacket. She did not take his hand. The touch was still too dangerous. He drove them out of the city, away from the glass towers and the manufactured elegance. They drove deep into the older parts of the borough, where the streets were lined with ancient oak trees and homes built from stone and honest labor. He stopped in front of a sprawling old colonial house. It wasn't a mansion, but a strong, weathered structure that spoke of history and endurance. The front yard was a mess of overgrown weeds and construction debris, but the bones of the house were noble. "This is the project," Cillian said, stepping out. "My grandfather built this house. It's where I grew up." Mary stepped onto the porch. The air here was cleaner, smelling of damp wood and aged plaster. The scent was a gentle balm after the chemical stink of the city. Cillian led her inside. The house was in the middle of a massive restoration. The walls were stripped down to the studs, exposing the original framework. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon light that poured through the bare windows. "It was crumbling," Cillian explained, his voice softer here, losing the steel edge. "The foundation was compromised. The beams were rotten. I could have bought any penthouse in the city, but I had to save this. It is the only thing I have that is real." He was using the house to talk about himself. They walked into what was once the living room. Cillian stopped and simply looked at the space. "My grandfather used to tell me that a man's legacy isn't the building he leaves behind, but the roots he plants," he murmured, his gaze drifting over the exposed wooden frame. "When I started my work, I forgot that. I built facades, not foundations." Mary felt a sudden, profound rush of empathy. This was the most honest conversation they had ever had. She saw the little boy who loved the scent of wood and the stability of a strong home, hidden beneath the architect who built glass cages. She walked toward a window, her hand tracing the thick, worn wood of the sill. "It's not too late, Cillian. You're restoring it. You're choosing to clean the house. The cleaning is the hardest part," he admitted. He walked up behind her, stopping a foot away, the proximity intense, yet completely non-sexual. It was an intimacy born of shared vulnerability. "There is so much rot to remove," he continued, his voice a low, painful confession. "So much that needs to be torn down before a new life can take root." He lifted his hand, and this time he didn't stop. He didn't touch her skin. Instead, his large, rough hand gently closed over her own, which was resting on the cold, exposed windowsill. The touch was not desire. It was a plea for stability. It was a quiet, overwhelming statement. "Anchor me." Mary didn't pull away. She allowed the heat of his palm to cover hers. She felt the calluses on his fingers, the physical proof of the hands that had built and taken, and she didn't fear them. She turned her head slightly, her cheek brushing the rough wool of his jacket. The movement was a profound, quiet gesture of acceptance. The physical act was minimal. The emotional surrender was complete. "The cleaning is necessary," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And the foundation can always be repaired, Cillian. It only needs the right anchor." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. The moment held for a long, quiet breath, filled only with the scent of old wood and the powerful, non-sexual chemistry of their shared truth. Cillian finally squeezed her hand, a firm, possessive, yet gentle pressure. "You are my anchor, Mary," he admitted, his voice a tight knot of emotion. "You are the only thing that keeps the current from pulling me under." He released her hand, the sudden loss of contact and emotional shock. He couldn't risk more. He had confessed too much. He stepped back, turning his attention to a stack of architectural drawings on a makeshift table. He had shown her his soul, and that vulnerability was the greatest expression of love he could offer. Mary remained by the window, her palm still burning from the touch of his hand. She knew then that she was not just in love with the complicated architect. She was in love with the wounded boy who was desperately trying to restore his own legacy. She had just shared his inheritance, and in that shared space, their vinculo emotional was sealed, stronger than any concrete Cillian could pour. The return from Cillian's childhood home had been quiet, contemplative. Mary carried the image of the stripped-down house, the honesty of the exposed beams, as a precious, fragile secret. The intimacy of that afternoon had been a peak. The fall was now inevitable. It happened late one evening. Mary was in her small city apartment, reviewing plant specifications, the window open to the cool night air. The city was a low, comforting hum. The quiet was suddenly shattered by a rapid metallic sound from the street below. The screech of tires cut short by the sickening thud of heavy vehicles colliding. Mary jumped up, rushing to the window. 2 black SUVs, the same type Cillian's security team drove, had violently boxed in a third, unmarked sedan. Before the scene could register, the doors of the SUVs flew open. Men in dark suits, moving with paramilitary precision, swarmed the sedan. Mary didn't see weapons. She didn't hear shouts. She only heard the cold, frightening efficiency of their movements. And then, she saw him. Cillian. He emerged from the lead SUV, framed by the harsh yellow glow of the street lamp. He was not the architect. He was not the restorer. He was the boss. His face, which she had seen so vulnerable and open just days before, was a mask of cold, absolute fury. He walked toward the sedan, his posture radiating a silent, terrifying authority. He bent down, speaking to the occupants of the car, brief, low words of command. Mary felt her breath stop in her throat. The men moved with a chilling, total obedience. They were not security guards hired for a project. They were an organized professional force. This wasn't a construction dispute. This was an operation. The truth, which she had tried to keep at bay, hit her with the force of a physical blow. The empire wasn't just built on contracts. It was enforced by them. She saw the full reality of the foundation Cillian had confessed to. A moment later, Cillian straightened up. His eyes, sweeping the street with the quick, instinctive vigilance of a predator, flickered up. He found her window. For a devastating second, their eyes locked across the distance. Mary saw the raw flash of recognition in his blue eyes, followed immediately by a sudden, intense alarm. The panic of a man whose carefully maintained boundary had just been obliterated. He knew she had seen everything. Cillian barked a rapid command at his men, his voice tight and urgent, and pointed toward her building. Mary didn't wait. The fear was a cold, sharp claw that grabbed her and pulled her away from the window. This was not the fear of being harmed. It was the overwhelming, crushing terror of the scale of his hidden world, and the knowledge that she was now inextricably linked to it. The realization that the gentle, strong hand that had touched hers was the same hand that commanded this terrifying, silent power was too much. I have to breathe. I have to find ground that is my own. She grabbed her coat, keys, and wallet. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely turn the lock. The floor felt suddenly unstable beneath her feet. The smell of the city air, which had moments ago been comforting, now reeked of exhaust, adrenaline, and danger. She fled her apartment, taking the stairs 2 at a time, her mind racing. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to break the immediate proximity of his control. She knew his men would be at her door within seconds. She had to escape the territory. She burst out onto the quiet back alley, the sound of her frantic footsteps echoing in the silence. She ran, not looking back, the terrifying image of Cillian's face, stripped of all pretense, cold, powerful, and utterly ruthless, burned into her mind. She ran until her lungs ached, the metallic taste of panic filling her mouth. She eventually reached the relative safety of a small, forgotten park, sinking onto a cold, isolated bench beneath a massive, ancient oak tree. She buried her face in her hands, her whole body trembling. She wasn't fleeing Cillian the man. She was fleeing the boss. The profound, absolute truth that the man she loved was an empire built on force, silence, and shadow. She knew one thing with absolute certainty. Cillian would find her. He had to. She was his structural necessity. But for now, Mary had to reconcile the man who tenderly repaired a family home with the man who commanded the night. The emotional fracture was complete, and she had to decide if her love for Cillian could survive the weight of his truth. The park was cold and damp, smelling of wet soil and late-night dew. Mary sat on the isolated bench, the massive oak tree a silent, indifferent witness. Her frantic energy had burned out, replaced by a hollow, paralyzing stillness. She was waiting, suspended in the aftermath. She didn't hear him approach. Cillian moved with a preternatural quietness. He appeared at the edge of the weak, flickering lamplight. He was alone. He wore the same dark clothing, now slightly disheveled, but the intense composure was gone. His posture was not aggressive. It was heavy, weighted with profound exhaustion and defeat. He looked less like a predator, and more like a man who had finally put down a burden he could no longer carry. He walked slowly toward her, stopping several feet away, honoring the distance she had created. He did not ask a question. He made no demand. "Mary?" His voice was low, broken, carrying the deep ache of failure. "You are safe." Mary finally lifted her head, her eyes burning from unshed tears. She looked at him, at the raw honesty of his face. He made no attempt to hide the truth. "I saw it, Cillian," she whispered, her voice raw. "I saw the reality of your foundation. The force, the control, the shadow." He nodded, a single agonizing motion of his head. "I know, and I am sorry that you had to see it. I did everything in my power to keep you in the light." "You lied to me," she said, the words heavy with pain. "I concealed the full truth to protect you from the full danger." He countered, his gaze intense. His blue eyes were clear, unwavering, reflecting the lamplight. I never lied about my intentions. I told you I control the flow, the structure, the people. I told you I would use any force necessary to ensure you are untouched. He took one slow step closer, closing the distance slightly. That chaos you saw tonight, that was a direct threat to you, Mary. It was an attack on the one thing I value that cannot be bought or enforced. I was protecting my anchor, my integrity, my only truth. He stood there, completely exposed, offering her his most dangerous, powerful self. He wasn't demanding her back. He was letting her choose the truth. The choice was not between the good man and the bad man. It was between the terrified woman and the complete, complicated man. Mary closed her eyes, feeling the cold air on her face. She remembered the house, the exposed beams, the rot he was determined to remove. She remembered the warmth of his hand over hers on the dusty windowsill. I fell in love with a man who wants to save a crumbling house, she said, opening her eyes. Not with a man who destroys things. Then see me, Mary, he urged, his voice heavy with emotion. See the entirety of me. I am a man who has immense power, and until you arrived, I only used it to build more cages. Now, I use that power to stabilize the good you put into the world. I used my force tonight to ensure your community garden, your passion, remains safe from the rot I deal with every day. He lowered his head, a profound gesture of surrender. I am not asking you to join the dark, Mary. I am asking you to be the light that determines how the darkness is used. He took another step, the final distance closing. He stood directly over her, his immense presence no longer threatening, but a wall of absolute quiet devotion. He lifted his hand, not to her face, but to the cold, dead bark of the massive oak tree behind her. His fingers gently traced the deep grooves in the ancient wood. I can't be weak for you, he whispered, his voice thick. But I can be honest. I love you, Mary. I love the simple, honest beauty you plant in the world. And I will use everything I am to ensure it survives. That is my truth. That is my surrender. Mary stood up. She walked into the warmth of his presence, not in fear, but in absolute, profound acceptance. She did not raise her hand to his face, but to the thick, protective wool of his jacket, gripping the fabric firmly. The embrace was not an act of passion. It was a profound vinculo-emotional. It was an act of two complex foundations finally aligning. She did not kiss him. She simply rested her head against his chest, inhaling the scent of his reality. Steel, leather, and the faint, unmistakable smell of safety. Cillian immediately wrapped his arms around her, a firm, possessive yet gentle embrace that communicated ownership of her safety, not her soul. He squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body shuddering with the relief of a man who had finally been granted peace. The simple, quiet closeness was the deepest form of intimacy. Mary knew the fight was not over. The shadows were still there, but she also knew that the boss had finally found his foundation, and his love was the only thing strong enough to build a real, enduring legacy. The slow burn was complete. They had chosen their future, rooted in the fierce, unyielding protection of a powerful love.
Between the lies, your name is written on my skin when no one ever looks inside. They build these walls to keep us safe, to keep our hearts in separate rooms. But every rule begins to fade the moment I step close to you. We speak in silence, breathe in doubt. Every touch we hide feels true. The closer we pretend not to be, the deeper I fall into you. Love me where no one knows my name, where the truth won't follow. If this moment is a sin, let it be tomorrow. Sorrow, hold me like the world is blind, like this fire won't be seen. If loving you is forbidden, then forbidden feels like me. We try to be the careful ones, to choose choose the road that hurts less. But every time I walk away, my heart refuses to forget. Your eyes say what your lips deny, a promise wrapped in fear. Every second we don't choose is another second lost right here. I feel you when I close my eyes in the space we shouldn't cross. Every rule we never broke is something beautiful we lost. Love me where the night is quiet, where no one dares to see. If this love has no future, let it have tonight with me. Kiss me like we're out of time, like we've already crossed the line. If loving you is forbidden, then I don't wanna be right. And if we pay for every breath, if this ends in goodbye, I'd rather burn in truth with you than live a perfect lie. So don't ask me to be stronger, don't ask me to let you go. Some loves are never meant to stay, they're meant to be felt, and that's all we know.